Welcome to the Eden Podcast, where we true the verse of Genesis 3:16, and we discover that God didn't curse Eve or Adam or limit woman in any way.
Joy found that the Hebrew text of Genesis 3:16 is clear, that God didn't curse Eve or Adam or limit woman in any way. This is where Sheila's specialty comes in. You may know Sheila from her blockbuster book, The Great Sex Rescue. Her book has the subtitle, The Lies You've Been Taught and How to Recover What God Intended. So, Sheila, what can go wrong in our marriages when people work from beliefs that put women down?
I think it goes back in some ways to Genesis, which you talk about so much, but that picture that we have of real intimacy before the fall, how men and women were each created in the image of God. They each showed the image of God. They existed in the garden together and they shared everything. And there was this mutuality and this intimacy. And that's what marriage is supposed to reflect. I mean, our God is a triune God. Our God is a relational God. Even within the Trinity, there is relationship, there is intimacy. And marriage was designed to experience that, to show that, to mirror that. But you cannot have intimacy with two people where one fundamentally does not matter as much as the other. Because if one person's needs matters more than the other, then you're not really listening to each other. You're not really valuing one another. And you can't have intimacy if you're discarding one person.
Now, you did research on a number of popular Christian books on marriage, and you found that they had some common themes. So in your book, I learned that most popular Christian books promote a hierarchical view of marriage, which doesn't sound like what you just tried to describe there, what you're saying we're supposed to go. I mean, Bare Marriage Podcast, that's yours. And where do we learn about bare marriage except in Genesis chapter 2? So could you tell us a story or two about these Christian books and problems that pop up as a result of that?
Yeah. So what we did in our study, we surveyed 20,000 women. So it's the largest study that's ever been done of Christian women. We've since surveyed a bunch of guys as well. And so we've now surveyed a total of 32,000 people. But, at the time we were looking at 20,000 women and we asked them to rate their marital and sexual satisfaction. And then we asked them if they had ever believed or had ever been taught certain key evangelical teachings. And among those teachings was this idea that the husband is the leader. He's the one who's supposed to make the final decisions. And a lot of people did believe that. That was widely believed. That's widely believed in the evangelical church, that the husband is the spiritual leader. He's the head of the wife. And what they mean by head is not what you mean by head in the second Eden book on Ephesians 5 and 6. But they think that it means some sort of an authority figure where he gets the final say. And so a lot of people do believe that. We found that believing it doesn't really matter, doesn't have a negative impact. And I think the reason is because the majority of people who believe it don't act it out. So we hear this in church all the time, but the majority of people who are married, who are Christian, actually want to love each other and do the right thing. And so they end up deciding things together. And they end up living out what is basically a marriage of equals. So they may say that they believe in hierarchy, but they don't actually act it out. When people act it out, so when he makes the final decision, even if he consults with her first, the divorce rate increases sevenfold.
Sevenfold?
Sevenfold.
Ooh.
And that's very similar to what John Gottman found, a leading researcher out of the John Gottman Institute. And he was speaking specifically about religious conservative people in this particular chapter, about how so many men will not share power and make the final decision. And when men do that, when they make the decisions rather than sharing the decision-making power, divorce is 81%.
Now you've been getting the word out, and you've been trying to encourage people to live a more shared, loving relationship. Have you been seeing any kind of results from your teaching?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff that's been really encouraging, because I just think God put in us this innate yearning for intimacy. And we know this. We all know this instinctively. And then the church has come in and taught us something which actually isn't intimacy. And a lot of people just are not comfortable with that. It's like they can't put words to it. They don't want to be rebellious. They don't want to say they don't believe in God, but it just doesn't fit right. And then when they read the findings of our survey, and they listen to people like you who say, look, there's another way of looking at these verses. It's almost like you feel validated. You feel relieved. You feel like, okay, I can finally be myself now. I can finally have the marriage that we wanted to have because we were trying to fulfill these roles and see each other in boxes instead of seeing each other as people. And that's what's happened, is that there's been tremendous freedom that people have found. And if you want proof of that, seriously, just go to Amazon and read the reviews for The Great Sex Rescue. Just read it, because over and over again, this was so validating. This was so freeing. And I'm sure you hear similar things about Eden, like finally, and that's a very common word too, finally. The problem that I'm up against is that even though scores and scores and scores of women and men feel that freedom, the evangelical establishment does not. And they've been blacklisting us and refusing to talk about our book and trying to get us disinvited from conferences. And when we're on big podcasts, they go and complain to those big podcasts and lots of things like that. So, and threatening to sue us, all kinds of stuff behind the scenes. Yeah.
And struggling with this reality, I've finally come up with a term. You've heard of big pharma and all kinds of big this and big that. And I've come up with the term big patriarchy.
Yeah.
I don't know how you feel about that term, but big patriarchy means that you got a publishing house that's got a translation that everybody is used to, and so they don't want to change because the people keep buying, and so if they change, they won't buy, and it's sort of a chicken and egg problem that they say they face. But what you've been doing is you've been saying, no, you can't go there. You can't say that. I think you're cracking that egg. And so to continue the silly analogy, we got to focus more on the chicken now. So the chicken has been publishing and spreading and teaching patriarchy and claiming that was in the Bible. And there's a whole branch of the church that has not been teaching that all along. And now we've been trying to provide more biblical basis of why patriarchy is not God's plan. Go back to Genesis chapter 2. The Hebrew word ezer, kenegdo, really comes out to be equal partners or corresponding partners. I read back in Strasbourg, France, in the archives, in the city archives, I came across the ancient document, I felt like it at the time, where John Calvin actually wrote out writing out his second edition of his Institutes, and he said that woman is a cook's helper, and according to Genesis chapter 2, she's not an equal partner, but she's a cook's helper, a subordinate. How does that affect our marriage relationship when you think that the woman is the cook's helper?
Mm-hmm. And that's what we've been seeing, is that's what leads to abuse. But sometimes I think we focus a little bit too much on abuse, because we go for the worst case scenario. And I'm not saying abuse isn't important, believe me. Like I'm constantly talking about how Emerson Eggerichs in Love and Respect enables abuse, because he does. And we have like 1,000 stories of that, literally, that have come into the blog about that. And that's really how I got started on this whole project. Was we read Love and Respect, and we heard from so many women where the book enabled abuse in their marriage. And we tried to call out focus on the family for promoting it, and they wouldn't listen. So we decided to go bigger with this survey. So I do completely believe abuse is big. However, I think the more common problem, because abuse probably affects anywhere from 10 to 25% of marriages, but the more common problem that affects even more is that when you create a situation where men's opinions matter more, and where leadership, him having authority and leadership, means that she's not supposed to question him, it also creates a situation where she can't bring up marriage issues, which she sees, or she can't be iron sharpening iron, which the Bible calls us to be. And that slowly becomes an entitlement on his part. And I believe what we're seeing is a lot of men are raised to be entitled and spiritually lazy. Or as Patrick Weaver says, grown-up man children. And I'm not trying to disparage men, because I actually think men are awesome. And I think that this whole theology does men such a disservice. And I'm so glad to see men speaking up about it, because more men need to. But the thought that a man cannot handle a wife having opinions of her own, that is somehow threatening, that if she were to bring up issues that she's not happy with, that is her being unsubmissive, it creates a situation where he thinks he has the right, that God has given him the right to live in a world where he's never questioned, where he just gets to do whatever he wants. Because that's what leadership means. You get to run the family however you want. And if she questions you, that's being unsubmissive. What happens when someone is told you have the right to do whatever you want? That's a really entitled mindset. Mm-hmm. And I think we have created a generation of very selfish men. Mm-hmm. And I don't think all men are like that, not at all. But that is the natural outcome of these teachings. And that's not of Jesus. And how are we supposed to have a big influence on the world if we're wrecking the character of so many men?
I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they said, well, as we go around the world, we ask women, what's one word that describes, what you want to be as a woman? What should you do? What's your calling? And the answer, according to this source, was submit. So they didn't say I'm a child of God or I'm called by the King, but I'm called to submit. And we've talked about Ephesians 5:21 and 22, where the whole concept of vertical submission is replaced by horizontal submission between Christians. And then that concept is taken right down into the next verse. So 5:22 would be husbands and wives submitting themselves one to another. So reciprocal submission. So you don't have a leader. You have two people that are busy submitting, and they're being taught and admonished by one another, and they keep submitting to that. I came across, I find that a lot of people keep unlearning what I thought they have learned. So when they come to Ephesians 6:4, where it says, don't provoke your children to wrath. The first word in that verse, most Bible translations say fathers. But in Greek, the word isn't fathers. The word is parents. It's the same Greek word used in Hebrews, where it talked about the parents of Moses. And so they'll hit a word here or a word there, and that'll trip them back into this hierarchical man in charge mindset. Are there a few key triggers like that you've come across, where men keep climbing up to the top of the podium and putting women down?
I think it's just throughout evangelical culture. And one of my concerns is that we've forgotten 1 Timothy 2, verse 5, which is a very important verse. It says, for there is one God and one mediator between God and humankind, the man Christ Jesus. We only have one mediator between us and God, and that's Jesus. And Jesus himself, of course, is God, but Jesus is our mediator on the cross. He paid our ransom, all of that. He is the one advocating for us. And yet what evangelical teaching tells us is that the way that a woman follows God is by following her husband. So whatever she does for her husband, that is unto Christ. And so she has to follow her husband, not follow Jesus. So her husband follows Jesus and the wife follows the husband. To me, that sounds like a violation of the second commandment, which is you shall have no other gods before me.
Right.
And when you're telling a woman that he is literally God in your life, that's idolatry. Mm-hmm. And we're teaching women to treat their husbands like idols. And a lot of people say, okay, but obviously she's not supposed to submit in sin. So she's supposed to submit to him and follow him, but she doesn't have to submit to sin. She just has to submit to everything else. And I find there's three big problems with that. Let's see if I can remember them all. Okay, first of all, if she's not supposed to submit if it's sinful, but she is supposed to submit if it's not sinful, then let's just talk about basically making decisions. Let's say that he wants to buy a house and she doesn't think they have the down payment for it. And so they're having a disagreement. And he says, well, you need to submit to me because I'm the leader. Okay. There's only two possibilities here. Either neither of them are hearing from God, or one of them is hearing from God. There is no possibility that both of them are hearing from God. Whereas if they were to work this out, if they were to seek more counsel, if they were to pray more, if they were to take more time, then they could get to a place where they're both hearing from God. So the best case scenario of her following him when they disagree is that one of them is hearing from God. But it's quite possible that neither of them is. And so you're not actually following God's will. You're just following the husband's will. And in doing so, you can often take a shortcut. Because if we think, well, as long as we're in disagreement, we're just going to follow what he says, then every time we're in disagreement, you can just say, well, we just get to do what he wants. So, he can just declare, nope, I'm sorry, we're doing it this way because I feel called to do it this way. Whereas a couple who is trying to follow God together might say, wow, okay, wait, we don't agree on this. That's a warning sign that there's something else going on here. Let's really wrestle this through. And they're going to do the real work. I talk to so many people who believe that the husband should make the final decision. And I say, I've been married 30 years. We've always made decisions together. We've never needed a tiebreaker ever. And they don't believe me that that's possible. And I think the reason they don't believe me is because they take shortcuts and they don't know what it's like to actually work something out and wrestle it through in prayer. And isn't that what we're supposed to be doing? So that's number one. Number two is it sets up this idea that the only way that she can actually submit and follow God is if they disagree. So disagreements are actually a good thing. It sets up this idea that the main thing about marriage that she needs to remember is that there will be disagreements. And so if you're in a marriage where you're actually working towards unity and intimacy and wholeness, and you don't get into a lot of these conflicts, she's never able to submit. And that's because our understanding of submission is entirely about decision-making, which makes no sense in light of Ephesians 5:21, right? Submit to one another, as opposed to being about servanthood and humility, as Jesus demonstrates in Philippians 2, verses 1-11, right? Where he took on human form and he gave himself up for us and he considered others. And that's what we should be doing. Now, the third thing is that if we say, well, she doesn't have to submit if he's sinning. No, look at the verse. It says submit in everything. So if you can't use that as an out, like these people who say that submission is about decision-making, but then they say, oh, but she doesn't have to submit if he's in sin. Paul never said that. Paul said to submit in everything. And if you understand submission as being about servanthood and looking out for someone's best, you totally can submit in everything. But if you only understand it about decision-making, then you run into real problems with that passage.
Let me come back to Ephesians 6:4, where people think it says, fathers, you're in charge of the kids. In your book, you referred to somebody who was it was a quote, someone who was a stern husband. What's a stern husband?
I think it's someone who does not take the emotional well-being of anyone in their family into consideration and allows their own and is trying to control other people through their behavior.
Yeah. I had a stern grandfather, and it was a sad situation for my grandmother. Yeah. They don't realize that in Genesis 3:16, when God is explaining, he looks into her heart and says, your affection is for your husband, but he will rule over you. The man has already disobeyed me and eaten the fruit. The man has already blamed you and me for eating the fruit. And now, look out, the man is going to continue, and he's going to usurp my place, God's place, and he's going to attempt to rule over you. People take that as if God has just said to the man, oh, you go rule over her, right? And I'm in charge of you, just like I was in charge of the animals. I named the animals. Oh, by the way, I'm going to slap a name on you. We were called the human beings, Adam, but now I'm going to take the name Adam, and I'll give you this other name over here. So a stern husband, it just doesn't work out in a Christian situation, does it?
It really doesn't. And the problem is that the way that we often give advice about what marriage should look like creates stern husbands, because men are told, take leadership, take command. You need to make all the decisions. And basically what they're told is to discount their wives' feelings. And women who live in marriages where the husband makes the final decision, I can't even remember the numbers. It's like 42 or 57 or some huge amount more likely to say, like 47 or 52 times more likely to say that my opinion doesn't matter.
Well, yeah.
My opinion doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
And how demoralizing is that?
Mm-hmm.
To be, and especially in a marriage relationship, if your opinion doesn't matter, you actually have very little agency over your own life. And that's not what Jesus ever intended. You know, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. So let's not be burdened again.
In the responses we've gotten for the first 50,000 downloads of the Eden podcast, and there's lots of things going on that I don't hear about, but the ones that I hear about are, a lot of them are women that have been in abusive marriages. And they're saying, I didn't respond because I thought the Bible said I couldn't respond, or I didn't complain, or I didn't get out, or whatever, because I thought the Bible was basically against me. Mm-hmm. And then they said, oh, but I've been binge listening to the Eden podcast on Genesis or Ephesians or Corinthians, and this is wonderful. And they go on and on. One of the things that's inspired in us is that we would like to help. That's one source of response. The other source of response is from people in ministry or people who are professional counselors who are dealing with these people. And they're saying, this is the kind of material I need. This is what I need to learn from the Bible. And I want to spread this. I want to keep going. And here's what we are doing. Well, I know of a wonderful Danish woman who's working in Pakistan, and she's ministering to people, to women that have been put down in the church and in the home, and they've been suffering from that. There's a wonderful couple that's working in Kinshasa, Congo, and they've started an outreach to abused and at-risk young women. They're in the capital city of 17 million people. They call it the Tabitha Center, where they train women for a year, teach them how to read and how to do math, and then how to do hand sewing with a hand crank sewing machine. And there's all kinds of ministries around the world and here in North America. And what I'm hoping we can do in the future is find a way to reach out and to help them. They don't have ways to raise funds. They don't have a way to receipt for funds. And I'm hoping we can begin to build a hub here and begin to minister to them. So there's big patriarchy that we have to face and change that on two levels: on the popular demand level for the kind of Bibles, et cetera, that people are asking for, and on the scholarship level where people say, no, we're not going to say that anymore. We need to correct that. And then over here, there's the ministry level where people are out there in the world and they're trying to rescue the perishing and do all that they can to help people. We need to keep going in both directions. Now, you have a whole specialty where you're talking about, all right, now in the marriage relationship, how do we do that? And how do we have great sex? And how do we go from there? Do you have, I think you do, you have other books and courses. Is there anything you'd like to recommend right now that people, not only do they look up The Great Sex Rescue, but what's another good book or two that you'd like to do?
Well, our upcoming books, The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex and The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex. So my husband helped co-author The Good Guy's Guide with me. They're different from The Great Sex Rescue in that The Great Sex Rescue is trying to show, here's how things got super messed up, and here's how we can do it better. And the other two books are saying, if we're going to build from the ground up on what is healthy, what would that look like? So it's not so much about tearing down that which is destructive as it is about building up what is healthy. And they're great for people that are just getting married. They're wonderful bridal shower gifts, or just if you want to understand how sex was supposed to work in the first place. So those are really fun.
That's a real bell ringer. Let me stop that for a second. There we go. Also, your daughter Rebecca wrote a book a while back that I remember reading, and I was impressed by that. Can you mention what that book is?
Yeah, so she's my co-author on The Great Sex Rescue, but she went really viral when she was 19 with a post on my blog on why she didn't rebel. And so she wrote a book, Why I Didn't Rebel, and basically what it's about is that if you want to raise a kid who doesn't rebel, you need to understand that it's not about your authority over her. It's about teaching her that it's okay to question things and how to have intimacy and authenticity with God, which means allowing her to question things and allowing her to see the world not in the same way you do necessarily. And so not the typical authoritarian parenting that we often hear in evangelical spheres, but instead more a picture of promoting authenticity and real intimacy in the family relationships too.
So you and your husband, Keith, are also successful parents. So that's
hopefully, and grandparents too.
True 316 Foundation is the home of the Eden podcast. Join us for $3.16 a month or more. Let's true the verses on the key passages on women and men. Go to true316.com/partner. True 316 is strengthening and encouraging many, and we're getting stories every day of lives changed through our ministry. We're the home of the Eden podcast, and we're getting the word out that God didn't curse Eve or Adam or limit woman in any way. Our volunteer help is wonderful, and we grow stronger with each new true partner who gives to the True 316 Foundation so that we can cover the costs to do the technical work of the Eden podcast, to coordinate our True School workshops like the 2-week Eden workshop on Genesis 2 and 3, and to make the True 316 Foundation function in its outreach to scholars and students around the world. You can give now with a one-time gift. And better still, you can join now and become a monthly donor. We call our monthly donors our true partners. Please join now by going to true316.com/partner.